So in this Chain of Command World War II podcast, we are going to explore a checklist of points to keep in mind regarding armor, regarding tanks on the tabletop, keeping in mind some of the unique features found specifically in the rule set for Chain of Command. Now, moving into this, of course, it depends not only on the forces that you're playing. Is it the British, the Russians, Japanese, Germans? Exploring early war, mid-war, and late war. That will unlock higher armor values and higher defense values. That will unlock more powerful guns. That will unlock faster tanks. But they all share similar attributes and similar things that need to be balanced out based on your support choices. So we start a game where we have a fixed number of units, and then in most games, modified slightly by attacker or defender, you're going to have support points. And in selecting armor, most of the time, that's going to be 80 or 90% of your support points. So right away, we get into this balance, this duality of, do I put literally all of my eggs in one basket into a very, very potent, a very, very powerful unit? But if I do, I need to make sure it's earning every single turn, and not that I ever want to lose a unit. I need to make sure that if I do lose it, it's certainly knocked down the command dice and put the hurt on my opponent. We need to be a little bit more conservative, where if you spread things out to another machine gun team or maybe another section or a couple of support weapons on there, again, it will allow you to focus and cover a little bit more of the table. So that's kind of the first logistics point moving into the game. Now, all the tanks, of course, modified by the time period again, they're going to have a main weapon, usually some sort of gun that is able to fire anti-tank or high explosive. Anti-tank going at other tanks and armored vehicles, high explosive going against building, fortifications, and infantry on there. You also have a secondary weapon, which might be a fixed machine gun. It might be a mounted machine gun. It might be a flamethrower. And being able to fire both depends on the junior officer. You have a junior officer that can issue 2 orders. One of those orders might be to move completely flat out as fast as you can. You won't be able to shoot. A hybrid order might be to move and shoot 1 gun, or to stay put and shoot both guns on there. And of course, you can also issue Overwatch on that. So a tank, what we see, certainly powerful, but not as nimble as infantry. You really need to kind of plan out what you're going to do, because you don't have access, unless it's purchased, specifically a senior officer. And there are some scenarios where your tanks will be upgraded to a senior officer. You're not able to necessarily split the platoon off and split the tank off and split the weapons teams off. Other things you see with infantry, where you can split your section and have one on Overwatch. You can advance with another. Not as fast, a little bit more ponderous. So we don't want to get ahead, because in Chain of Command, while we don't always know, depending on the mission, what our opponent has, there's going to be tactical assets on the table already deployed or about to be deployed, and then there's stuff held in reserve that are brought on from various jump-off points on there. So I certainly, if I suspect or I know that my opponent has a dedicated anti-tank gun with a crew, and it's not on the table yet, do I really want to be aggressive and push that tank forward? Possibly. And we'll look at a couple of ideas to keep in mind when it comes to advancing your tank. But these are the things, because it's a bigger target, and range and Chain of Command, unlike other war games, is essentially the entire table on there. So a position on the back end of the table with a little bit elevation can put that anti-tank gun just waiting to ambush, and the tank, being a bigger model, standing a little taller, especially some, from the German perspective, later war tanks, they are huge in appropriate scale. You're going to see it, you're going to hear it everywhere. We need to keep that in mind. So with this, when we deploy, per the rules, you come on the road, if there's a road in the game. And for the most part, I want to try and stay on that road, because it's going to allow me to move without penalty. As soon as you move off the road with a tank, there is the possibility of you just getting stuck in the mud. If you go over a barrier, a fortification, a wall, there's a chance to get stuck. Being a gambling man myself, I will take that chance every now and then. It is a somewhat small chance based on the dice that you're rolling, but it is a possibility. And then once you get stuck, in order to free yourself, there's an increased chance of becoming immobile. If you become immobilized, you are a sitting target on there. When your opponent is shooting at your tank, the bonuses for a tank not moving make it much, much easier to hit. So this is something to keep in mind. We either want to be moving or at the very least be hull down, be behind some sort of wall, some sort of fortification, maybe on that tree line, offering something up, one or the other. We generally do not want to stop out in the open as a tank. Now on the opposite side, in terms of engaging enemy units, you are essentially immune to machine guns, mortars, and small arms fire with that. That is something we want to utilize. That is something we want to push ahead. If you can get a tank on the table with good fields of fire, possibly hull down behind something, and fire away with the high explosive rounds, fire away with the machine gun, any type of infantry out in the open, or even if they're behind cover, the volume of dice that you put out, you're going to kill a few. You're definitely going to pile the shock on. And at the very least, you're going to tie up their junior officer and a senior officer issuing commands to remove that shock so they don't break. You can easily defeat or tie down multiple infantry units. And if we think about the narrative and the simulation on the table, a tank is a fearsome machine, a piece of machinery on there. It can definitely do that. Now, on the opposite side, dedicated anti-tank teams. And of course, from the German perspective, playing the Germans most of the time in Chain of Command, I'm on the lookout for dedicated anti-tank field guns or bazooka teams on there. These two types of elements, when they attack straight on, you're going to have more armor on the front of the tank, right? Just tank tactics 101. Less armor on the side, less defense dice to block on the side, and nothing on the back. I will say, most of the time, 90% of the time, you will be engaging front armor to front armor. If you're fighting another tank or if you're fighting an anti-tank crew on there, it's just kind of the nature of pushing one against the other. And of course, it's a dice-off, and it depends on a lot of factors, and maybe two tanks can gang up on one tank and kind of engage. But we need to be on the lookout for infantry teams, especially dedicated bazooka teams, support choices that have the ability to move or break off and get to the side on there. And if we are trying to play as accurate as possible, Fortress Europe in France, a lot of terrain, a lot of hedgerows, a lot of forests on there. Infantry are very nimble. They can move very, very fast. And with true line of sight representing everything, it's much easier to hide them. So you can have infantry move and a tank might not necessarily be able to get to them. That's why you need a screening force of infantry. You need some sort of screening force to protect that tank and at least tie things up or neutralize things so it could potentially redeploy. So now we get into the command dice. You generate enough command dice and you can set an ambush. This is something that we need to keep in mind as we push forward, not only suppressing what is on the table, deployed that we know about, whether it's anti-tank gun, infantry, or other enemy armor, we need to be aware of what our opponent might have in reserve and come out next turn. But then we also need to be aware of an ambush, where they can take one of these anti-tank units, deploy it, shoot, and then pull it off the table. So two ways to deal with that, because that's a tanker's worst nightmare, and in the game, in the rules, it makes sense. I don't know where that bazooka team is on the table. It's been pushing forward, undiscovered. It's hidden. I'm moving down the road on there. I pass a hedgerow, and it just pops right out. You know, that's what the rules and that's what the command dice and the choices of an interrupt ambush represent. My choices are generate enough command points and have a chain of command die ready that in my turn I can interrupt and fire. That's a possibility, but I'm blowing a command die that maybe I want to use for my own ambush or use to not take a check to see if I lose a unit on there. A second option is to be on overwatch with the tank, to move slowly, potentially put things on Overwatch, or have a machine gun team or other type of infantry team that can put out some decent dice to at least suppress and go on Overwatch next to the tank if there is nothing to shoot. That's the biggest challenge that I find playing tanks. Of course, engaging tank to tank, there is maneuverability, there is a tank duel, it's back and forth, but again, for the most part, I can keep my front armor facing you on there. I can be moving and make sure I'm turning, hull down. The danger becomes when I need to advance, either based on the mission or the fluidity of my own infantry advancing, and I want to leverage the fact that I have high explosive rounds and I've got machine guns in a unit that has higher visibility that essentially other infantry teams can't even touch. They can't even damage. I want to advance to that. It's having something pop up and get side armor. It's having something pop up and get rear armor on there. So going back to our original focus of the podcast, understanding that tanks are not as nimble as infantry. You need to be a little more cautious. You need to be a little bit more careful on how they push forward and how they operate on the table. Comparing and contrasting that to other wargaming systems that are out there that are a little bit more fluid with tanks, where essentially tanks and armor, they exist like any other unit on the table, possibly a little bit more dynamic.